Welcome to Thought Decoder with Sean Mixon. Today we're decoding the thought of Dr. Stephen Myers. Dr. Myers, thanks for coming on.
It's very nice to be with you, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Well, for those of you who don't know Dr. Myers, Dr. Myers is known for his massive works. He doesn't publish many. He hasn't published many books, but each book it's like three books if you think about it. So the first book he was known for was Signature in the Cell. Then the second book that he published was Darwin's Doubt, and then the most recent book is The Return of the God Hypothesis. Dr. Myers is an excellent communicator. He's able to explain things, I like to say, to a 4-year-old and on up to the professor. He has a narrative prose providing the historical context of scientific discoveries while presenting his arguments. And Dr. Myers' particular style of argumentation is the argument to the best explanation. Dr. Pierce many years ago showed that abduction could be interpreted as a form of affirming the consequent, which is a logical fallacy. So Dr. Myers, in his wisdom, has chose not to use that form, but to use argument to the best explanation. And generally, that approach is set out as follows: you establish some data set, some group of observations. You lay out the criteria for evaluating those hypotheses or any explanations of the data set. Specifically in the historical sciences, Dr. Myers writes that that's causal adequacy and causal existence. Then the third step is you evaluate alternative explanations. And 4, you infer the best explanation. Dr. Myers, is that pretty much sum up your approach? Or am I missing something there?
That's a pretty good summation, right? It's a method commonly used in the sciences, sometimes also called the method of multiple competing hypotheses, but it's particularly used in the historical sciences, where you're trying to infer what caused something to happen in the remote past. And since you're not there to see it, and since you cannot make that event necessarily happen repeatedly under controlled laboratory conditions, you have to use a slightly different method of scientific reasoning. And I found this method used in the works of Charles Darwin. I found it used in a mentor of his, articulated rather explicitly and beautifully by the great geologist Charles Lyell in the 19th century. And so this is a very common practice in geology, in archaeology, and evolutionary biology, cosmology, a number of the historical sciences. It's also used in theoretical physics. It's not a method that's exclusively used in historical sciences. And the key criterion for establishing, for assessing which of a number of competing causal hypotheses is best is what you mentioned, this idea of causal adequacy. Charles Lyell put it this way when he, in the cover front piece of his great work on geology, Principles of Geology, he said, "The attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation." So our knowledge of cause and effect allows us to assess which among a set of competing hypotheses provides the best explanation for a given piece of data or a given event in the past. That's a lot of abstract discussion. Let me break that down with a good example. I went to university in Eastern Washington, a small liberal arts college called Whitworth. My graduation day was quite a while ago now. It was the day that Mount St. Helens blew up. Now, if you didn't know about the the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and you were going out into the Palouse country of eastern Washington today, you might have a mystery on your hands when you encountered little patches of white powdery stuff that's still out there. So imagine you're out in the Palouse today, you come across a patch of white powdery stuff, you wonder, well, what is this? Where did it come from? What caused this to be here? Well, you would use this method. You would say, well, maybe it was an earthquake. Maybe it was a flood. Maybe it was a rainstorm. Maybe it was a volcanic eruption. Now, of those four possible causal hypotheses, which one is the best? Well, if we apply the method of causal adequacy, we would correctly infer that the white powdery stuff was produced by a volcanic eruption. Why? Because we have present knowledge of what volcanoes do, and we know that volcanoes produce white powdery stuff, whereas wind and rainstorms and floods and earthquakes don't do that. So our knowledge of cause and effect allows us to assess those possible explanations. And this was the force behind Charles Lyell's famous dictum, "The present is the key to the past." Our present knowledge of cause and effect allows us to assess the plausibility of competing hypotheses about what happened in the past. So that's the method that I use to develop the argument for intelligent design. Many people say intelligent design isn't scientific, but in fact, it uses the very same method of scientific reasoning that Charles Darwin used and other historical scientists use in reconstructing the past. So it's a perfectly scientific approach to a deep question, and that is, well, what caused life to arise on planet Earth in the first place? And that was the subject of my first book, which you kindly showed, Signature in the Cell, the question of the origin of the first life.
Go get it, people. Yeah. So, Dr. Myers, you it seems as if you almost anticipated my first question. But before I go there, I'm going to make a foolish decision and follow up with something you said. How does the principle of uniformity relate to these criteria?
Well, uniformitarianism is associated with Charles Lyell. It's one of the principles that he advanced in order to reconstruct the past in using these historical scientific methods. So it's kind of an assumption of the historical scientific method that the basic laws and properties of nature remain constant over time. There's different forms of uniformitarian thinking. There's a more restrictive or even more, I would say it's a more restrictive assumption, and that is the idea that not only do the basic laws and properties of the universe stay the same, but the processes that we see today are the only processes that have ever been in operation, and that only gradual kinds of processes are at work. There were no catastrophic events in the past. So that's a form of uniformitarianism that I think is too aggressive in its affirmations. We can affirm that the laws and constants of physics, the laws and the basic properties of physics have remained constant, without saying that the kinds of processes that we see today at a higher level, waterfalls or volcanic eruptions or things like that, are the only kind of things that have ever happened. We have sediment accumulating in river deltas. Well, that doesn't mean that there wasn't in the past some occasions where there might have been an ice dam that broke and caused a vast amount of water to rush over the landscape in a rapid time. I use that example advisedly because here in eastern Washington and western Montana, we now think there was such a catastrophic event. That event did not violate any laws of physics and chemistry, but apparently there was an ice dam in western Montana that broke, and it created a very interesting pattern of scarring on the land in eastern Washington as that water rushed out. And there's a phenomenon in eastern Washington known as the channeled scablands, which geologists now have concluded it was the result of a catastrophic geological event, not one that we see happening every day. So maybe this is a better way to put it. There's uniformitarian. There's the assumption of the uniformity of underlying laws of physics and chemistry, and then there's the idea of the uniformity of events. That the kind of events we see today are the only kind of events that have ever happened, and that latter principle I think is a bit suspect. The former principle I think is pretty much fundamental to doing science, in particular historical science, and it also flows. I think there are some creationists who have held up uniformitarian thinking as a kind of a bugaboo or an enemy to a theistic view. I think, in fact, it flows out of a theistic view as part of the presuppositions that gave rise to modern science, because the scientists assumed that the God of the universe was a God of order, and he was sustaining the universe with regular patterns of order that we described as the laws of nature. They assumed that uniformity would continue, and it was in fact an expression of the character of God. This was, a theistic assumption that came right out of the Bible. In the book of Hebrews, it says he sustains the universe by the word of his power, or in Colossians, in Christ all things are held together. The early founders of modern science affirmed these biblical principles as the basis for their theology of nature, and out of that came what we call the scientific method, or I think there are different scientific methods, but basic principles that allowed science to investigate nature profitably. So I'm for uniformitarianism of the first kind, concerning the laws and constants and properties of nature, but I think events and discoveries have shown that the second kind, event uniformitarianism, if you will, has not been is not as fruitful a principle, and has been contradicted by discoveries that we've made in the historical sciences.
Wow, that was very good. So
I don't think anyone's ever asked me about that, so this will
oh,
have
really?
some completely unique content on this podcast.
Yeah, yeah, and it just made me think that the second form, the form of uniformitarianism of events, is it seems as if it would be motivated by a type of materialism.
It would be, I think, or has been, because there's one source of unique events in the universe that materialists don't want to acknowledge, and that is creative intelligence. Creative agents like ourselves, or if we are believers in God, like God Himself, have libertarian freedom. We can act in new and creative ways and to produce events that have not ever been produced before. And so, if you want to insist that we only are going to posit causes that explain events of the kind that always happen and have always happened, and there will be no other kinds of events, and no unique particular events in the history of the cosmos, you're effectively ruling out agent causation as a possible cause, because one of the things that agents do is they generate events that are they are non-uniform and idiosyncratic. We lived in Britain for quite a while when I was doing my PhD, and have been back quite a number of times. And one thing we always say about British culture, especially academic culture, is many things are idiosyncratic and non-uniform. There's 31 colleges in Cambridge, and the head of each college, many of the heads of colleges have completely different titles than the other heads of colleges. You have masters and presidents and wardens, and there's no uniformity to the way the Brits do things. That's part of the charm of England. So anyway, we want to be agents can produce idiosyncratic, unique, particular events that may not have ever been produced before. So if you want to insist that we only have boring monotony in the universe and we have event uniformitarianism, you would be ruling out agency.
Right, and I wonder if there's some sort of special pleading involved, in the sense that it's would seem to limit the principle of uniformitarianism to events on Earth, right? Because otherwise, would it imply that life is always popping up other places, or that?
Well,
How does that work?
that's a good question too. The one thing we can say is that we don't know of any forms of life beyond planet Earth, and there have been a couple of great books on that. One was written, I think, 2005 by the University of Washington astronomers Peter Ward and Brownlee. I've forgotten his name, and Ward and Brownlee's book Rare Earth, and then that thesis was developed in a different, more explicitly pro-ID way by Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards in their book Privileged Planet. And so, if you want to insist on event uniformitarianism, it's very hard to insist on that, because our planet is so incredibly unique, and the events that have taken place here have not taken place anywhere else, certainly in our solar system and in any other solar system that we yet know of. So but we do want to assume that the basic laws of physics, the four fundamental force laws, and the speed of light, and the many properties of the universe are constant. The mass of a quark is going to be the same throughout the universe, and we have some evidence of that, but we haven't been able to sample the whole of the vast universe with its 2 trillion galaxies. So this is an assumption that we bring to our science many times. And I think this underscores another important point. We often say that, we pose science and faith as opposites, but at a presuppositional level, science has to, by faith, affirm many principles that it can't absolutely prove. This was the great insight of the skeptical philosopher David Hume, that if we want to say that the present is the key to the past, or the way he put it was that the future will be like the present, he said, well, we can't know that, because we have no observational evidence of the future yet. So he showed that assumption, which undergirds all inductive reasoning, one of the main forms of reasoning in the sciences, is not something we can prove by experience, by observation. And instead, it reveals the fact that we assume that reveals an even deeper assumption in the uniformity of nature. And that by that, he meant this kind of uniformity of the basic laws and constants of physics. And he famously showed that if you want to prove that principle of uniformity, you have to make inferences about how nature has behaved at different times in the past up until the present. And yet, to make those kinds of inferences is to use inductive reasoning, but he meant to justify inductive reasoning by reference to the underlying principle of uniformity. And therefore, he and anyone who attempt to make that justification would be necessarily reasoning in a circle. And so, we're stuck. Our scientific reasoning cannot be justified empirically. So he was a radical empiricist. He wanted to say the only thing we can know is through the senses. Is the only thing we know is things that we observe through the senses. But yet he found that he could not justify scientific reasoning on that basis. I think there's a way out of that circle, and that is a yet deeper presupposition. And this is the one that the early founders of modern science made, and that is the presupposition of the existence of a benevolent God who both made our minds with those assumptions, like the uniformity of nature or the assumption of causality, and made nature in a rational way so that what we're assuming about it actually matches the way he made it, that there's a principle of correspondence. And this was another way of explaining the idea of intelligibility, which was also a key assumption of modern scientists, who said there's a rational order to nature because it was made by a rational creator. We can understand that rational order because that rational creator made our minds in his image, so we could perceive what he had made. And so again, a principle of correspondence that gave people confidence that nature had secrets that could be revealed by careful observation. And as philosophy has become more and more secularized, we've lost the grounds. A secular and materialistic worldview really can provide no basis for us for justifying the reliability of the human mind. That those assumptions that we make seem to materialists to be completely arbitrary, and this is part of the importance of Plantinga's work, Warrant and Proper Function, which you mentioned in our pre-interview discussion. Plantinga shows that evolutionary theory can explain, or might be able to account for, beliefs that we have that lead directly to survival, but there is a vast amount of scientific theorizing that goes on that's much more abstract and has no direct, and would have had, and more importantly, would have had no direct survival value on our ancestors. So how do we justify the reliability of our minds as they are thinking about things that don't necessarily involve escaping from saber-tooth tigers? He also shows that there are beliefs that we can have that may be false, that may inadvertently advance survival value, but are not necessarily true. And what's interesting is even the leading evolutionary proponents, such as Richard Dawkins, have acknowledged that there's a negative correlation between our beliefs and survival value. The truth of our beliefs and their survival value. For example, Dawkins says that the reason that religion is so prevalent is that a belief in God promotes survival and human flourishing and the passing on of genes through stable families, etc. But that belief is false. Well, that means that evolutionary, on his account of things, that means our evolution, the evolutionary process programmed into us a false belief. So there's a negative correlation between what we believe and what the evolutionary process and favors as far as survival, which completely undermines our belief in the reliability of the mind on an evolutionary, naturalistic account of the origin of the mind, which is Plantinga's big point. So I think theism has an absolutely unique, the ability to justify the reliability of our minds is, I think, uniquely provided by theism, or theism provides a unique account, a uniquely favorable account as to why the mind would be reliable, that allows us to have confidence in science among the competing worldviews. Materialism undermines it, and Plantinga shows that brilliantly.
Oh wow, you've brought Darwin and Dawkins and Plantinga together. that is awesome. Wow.
Well, Sean, I know. I mean, you and I have in common are we're philosophers, and I think we probably were going to talk about the science in my books, but I think this question of epistemology, how do we know what we know, and how do we justify our ability to know it, is the most fundamental question in modern philosophy.
Wow.
And since figures like Hume in the Enlightenment, Kant is interesting as well. I think Kant kind of shows the way. I think there's an implicit theistic message in Kant that he sometimes doesn't get credit for, or at least I think Kant can be appropriated by theists to help give a robust account of why the mind is reliable. He shows that there are these structures of the mind, which he calls the synthetic a priori. And those are basically assumptions. They can be cashed out as propositions about the world. All events have causes. Nature is uniform in its basic laws and properties. There's certain geometric principles that we assume in order to make sense of the sense data coming in. And you can state these as propositions. Then that raises the question, well, Kant says we can't help but think as if these propositions are true, as if we process information using these categories of the mind. And he says we can't ask questions about them because we can't think without them. But I think you can extract them as propositions, and then ask the question: on what basis can we accept the synthetic a priori, the statements, the informative statements about the world? They're not tautological. They're not. He has another category called the analytic a priori. All bachelors are unmarried males. That's analytic. That's true by definition. But there are things that we assume about nature that are not true by definition, but which are necessary to think at all. And Kant says, well, since they're necessary to think at all, we can't ask any questions about them. So he resists the impulse to attribute them to the creator, which is interesting in his part, because in his work on the categorical imperative, he does develop a moral argument saying that God is necessary to objective morality. But he resists the conclusion that God is necessary to having objective knowledge about the world, to do science. But I think the same kind of move can and maybe should have been made in Kant, and to say, well, on what basis can we accept these underlying assumptions that we're making about nature? Are they true or false? I would say if you have a prior assumption of theism, you have good reason to believe that they're true. If you assume that there was a benevolent creator who made our minds in his image so that we could know the mind or know the world that he had made, and the rational order he built into it, you have a coherent epistemology. But it starts with the assumption of theism. This is what's known as the presuppositional argument. The argument from epistemological necessity. It's a presuppositional argument rather than an evidential argument. But I found this extremely persuasive. This is one of the things that anchored me in a theistic belief when I didn't want to be a Christian, and I couldn't get away from this. And I discussed this in the very last chapter of Return of the God Hypothesis, which is mostly a book making evidential arguments for theistic belief. But I do think you can come full circle and say, well, yeah, but there's a good presuppositional argument as well. So anyway, sorry to go off on that little tangent, but I think this is the central question. The central question of modern philosophy: on what basis can we trust the human mind? Darwin himself was very worried about this. He said, if our minds are the result of an undirected process that produced them from the minds of the lower animals, on what basis can we be confident that we're thinking, that our thinking is any more reliable than their thinking, if they're thinking anything at all? He said. So this worried him, and Plantinga has
Darwin's doubt.
This was another of Darwin's doubt. Yeah, in fact, there's a very good philosophy professor at Gonzaga University, David Calhoun. He may be retired now, but I knew him when I was a young philosopher in the same city at Whitworth University. And he wrote a very good paper on Darwin's doubt, but he wasn't talking about the Cambrian explosion, which was the doubt that I zoomed in on. It was this, I think, even more profound doubt about the reliability of the mind if his evolutionary account of human origins is true.
I know that Plantinga calls that Darwin's doubt, and I remember reading and thinking that I said, "Oh, Steve Myers and Alvin Plantinga, they both right about Darwin's doubt, but it's a different doubt.
It's a different doubt. Yeah. Well, we've explained the doubt about the Cambrian explosion to Al, and I think he was very receptive to that. He's famous for he's argued in I've forgotten the title of the fairly recent book about science and faith, and if they're in conflict, where the conflict lies. Yeah, right. And he's argued that it's logically possible to reconcile some form of evolutionary thinking, especially if it's theistic, with a robust form of theism. But in conversations we've had with him, he's been very explicit. He said, that doesn't mean I think that evolutionary theory is adequate. It's not. I'm not vouching for the science. I'm just saying that there might be a logical path to reconciliation. But in his work on warrant and proper function, he says, if you can join naturalism with an evolutionary account of human origins, then you've got real epistemological problems. And I think that's a really compelling case. I sketched that, his argument, his version, in a shorter form in the last chapter of Return to the God Hypothesis.
Okay. Yeah, so you mentioned something earlier. You said intelligent design is scientific. I wonder, would there be a difference between something being scientific and something being science? Uh,
Well,
is
maybe.
intelligent design a science? So that was my question.
Yeah.
Is it a science?
Well, you may know that I'm not a big fan of these demarcations that want to put thought about different subjects in different kinds of boxes, or rather to say that uh, there's a unbridgeable chasm between philosophical or metaphysical reasoning and scientific reasoning. Um, there are scientific theories that have clear metaphysical implications, and in philosophy, metaphysics is, after all, the subject of being. Right? It's ontology. It's the subdiscipline of philosophy that attempts to tell us what is the case about the world. Well, doesn't science do that very same thing? So this attempt to demarcate science from philosophy and say they're two fundamentally or qualitatively different things, I think just doesn't work. And I think most
Mm-hmm.
philosophers of science have come to that position. There's this famous problem known as the demarcation problem. If you try to define science normatively based on the methods that scientists use, well, you have trouble, because it turns out that philosophers use those same methods, and detectives use those same methods, and
Mm-hmm.
ordinary people use those same methods, and
Mm-hmm.
lawyers use them in court. And well, there are certain types of things we do in laboratories that we don't do other places, but the basic mode of testing an idea in the scientific lab from a logical standpoint is no different than testing a metaphysical idea or an historical idea. It involves three key elements, and this is where I love Bayesian thinking. It involves having a hypothesis, generating expectations from the hypothesis about what you ought to see if the hypothesis is true, and then looking at the world to see whether or not what you observe matches what you would expect if your hypothesis is true. Now, Karl Popper made a big deal out of saying that the kinds of empirical expectations generated from a hypothesis must be predictive. They must be facts we don't yet know. Fair enough. There are many hypotheses that generate those kinds of empirical expectations. There are things about which we have not yet made any observations. But there are other kinds of sciences where we already know a bunch of facts and we're trying to explain them after the fact. So we think, well, if my hypothesis were true, would I expect those already known facts to be the case or not? Or is there a better hypothesis that would explain why we see what we see? So I think the temporal asymmetry of prediction and explanation after the fact is pretty much irrelevant to the efficacy of a hypothesis, to its warrant or explanatory power, predictive success. I think are both modes of confirmation of hypothesis. And a good example of that is relativity theory, general relativity. There's a very astute historian of science at University of Maryland named Stephen Brush, who showed that Einstein's theory of general relativity was largely accepted in the physics community on the basis of facts it already explained, anomalies it already explained, long before the famous, or it wasn't long because there was not that much time that elapsed from 1915 to whatever it was, 1920 or 1919, I can't remember, the famous Eddington experiment with the light bending. Well, that was a prediction of general relativity, but general relativity was already largely accepted among leading physicists because it explained already known facts and anomalies better than classical alternatives. So explanatory power is often sufficient to confirm a hypothesis, with or without additional predictive success. Of course, it's best if you have both. And so anyway, that was another tangent, but I think it's an important thing, because I think the theory of intelligent design is said not to be scientific because it doesn't make predictions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, it does make predictions, but
Mm-hmm.
like many other successful theories, it's gained traction initially because of its ability to explain already known facts better than alternative hypotheses. And my work, the work of Michael Behe, the Guillermo Gonzalez, Jay Richards book. I mean, there have been a number of books advancing, certainly Dembski's work on design detection. But as we look at different facts that we want to explain, for example, the origin of the information necessary to produce the first life, it turns out that intelligent design provides a better, more causally adequate explanation of that information than do alternative naturalistic approaches. And that's the argument that I make in Signature in the Cell. At the end of the book, I show that, well, it has superior explanatory power with respect to what we've learned about the information contained in DNA and the complexity of cells, but it also generates some interesting predictions that are different than those that you would expect, that involve different empirical outcomes than you would expect from a chemical evolutionary account of the origin of the first life, for example. So we think intelligent design both has explanatory power and heuristic value in that it generates it generates predictions about the world that we can go out and look and evaluate or test. And so from that standpoint, I think it is a science and it is scientific. But the people who want to advance a demarcationist agenda and want to disqualify intelligent design on the basis of abstract demarcation criteria of the form, well, it's not a scientific theory because it invokes an unobservable entity. I think they have real problems making those kinds of arguments, because it turns out that many scientific theories that we accept as scientific also invoke unobservable entities. Darwinism in particular invokes unobservable past transitional intermediates and mutational events as part of its explanatory apparatus. And those things are not observable in the laboratory or even in the field. And so theoretical physics would be nothing if we outlawed unobservable entities. And there are any number of alleged demarcation criteria, criteria that supposedly define science normatively, that allow us to exclude non-scientific or pseudoscientific theories at the outset of an investigation without even looking at the evidence. And I think they all fail. That invariably, if they disqualify one theory, they will disqualify its competitors, or if they fail to disqualify one theory, they will fail to disqualify its competitors. These criteria do not discriminate between competing empirical explanations of the facts, even if people want to say one of those types is metaphysical and another is scientific. They just don't do that work, these demarcation criteria.
Yeah, I just think about the relevance of the question to the truth of the hypothesis. It seems to me, it's obvious that intelligent design could be true and not science. So, in one sense, who cares?
Right. No, this is my main message in all this, Sean. It's we don't. At the end of the day, we don't. What we care about is whether the hypothesis is true or most likely to be true among a set of competitors. We are not concerned. We shouldn't be concerned principally with how to classify it. I mean, that's all this is. It's a debate about nomenclature. Mm-hmm. All right, I've said, look, all right, you want to call intelligent design quasi metaphysical speculation about the distant past. Fine, call it that. I don't care what you call it, but make sure you call Darwinism and chemical evolutionary theory the same thing, because they use the same kinds of methods, and they're either equally capable of meeting various demarcation criteria, or they're equally incapable, depending on which criteria you choose and how restrictively you want to apply them. I wrote this essay early in my career called The Methodological Equivalence of Design and Dissent with Modification, the Darwinian idea. They're absolutely equivalent in their scientific status with respect to these demarcation criteria that get thrown around, and people put these up on Facebook. They're in the social media. This stuff is in the water, and it's the residual legacy of logical positivism and neo-positivist philosophy of science, which has almost no proponents or advocates now among professional philosophers of science. These accounts of how scientists reason have blown apart. They don't work. They're inaccurate to what scientists actually do. So
Okay, and there are
anyway,
also
enough on
okay.
that. You're going to get me. I'm just launching on my little pet peeve here, but. Fortunately, most philosophers of science share this pet peeve. Now they say Larry Loudon famously said, demarcations arguments don't work, and because of that, we should get rid of terms like pseudoscience. They're just pejoratives that we try to use
Yeah.
to settle debates without engaging the crucial evidential issues involved in the scientific debates or the metaphysical debates, whatever you want to call them. I'm perfectly happy to, in the new book, to call the God hypothesis a metaphysical hypothesis. But, it's also, I want to adjudicate that hypothesis based on scientific evidence. So is it scientific or metaphysical? I mean, likely it's both. It's a renewed form of natural theology.
I like that. Yeah. So,
all of the
Blanchard,
above: science, historical science, natural theology, metaphysics. Categorize it how you will, but let's now get beyond that and evaluate whether or not it's likely to be true, because that's what should interest us.
Absolutely. Plantinga was in a discussion panel. It's on YouTube, and during the discussion, one of the professors says he was giving his evolutionary argument against naturalism, and they were asking questions about how thick is his conception of God. And then one gentleman said, well, what you call God and the properties you prescribe to God are not necessarily what this, he mentioned a certain religious system and said that this system wouldn't view God that same way. So I wouldn't call that necessarily theism. And Plantinga said, well, theism, call it Shmeism. He said, call it whatever you want, but this is the way I'm using the term. And,
Yeah.
and this is my argument. So what do you have to say?
And these are the properties associated with this concept called God that entity must possess if we're to explain phenomenon X, which is, so, a thin versus a thick version of theism that's an interesting philosophical distinction. I think I make my case for the God hypothesis in the book is for a reasonably thick version of theism, but you can't derive all the properties, or we can't derive everything that we know about God from Holy Scripture, from the natural world, and the Bible itself is explicit about that. In Romans 1, it says that we, from the things that are made, we can know the power and the divine nature. In older translations, often rendered wisdom of God from the things that are made in nature. But do we know the plan of salvation? Do we know some of the other things that theologians, other attributes of God that theologians derive from an analysis of Holy Scripture? Do we know his heart for the lost? Do we know his compassion for orphans and widows? Do we know his loving kindness? Probably not from cosmology. No, I don't go that far. Some Christian apologists sometimes sound like they think they can deduce the whole of the gospel from the fine-tuning argument. I don't think you can do that. But I don't think that means that what we can know about God from the fine-tuning of the universe, or the beginning of or from the fact that the universe had a beginning, or from the complexity and informational properties of life, is not interesting or important. I think it gets us thinking in the right direction and affirming the reality of a transcendent intelligence who is also active in the creation. That's a basic form of theism. That's not deism. It's not panspermia or space alienism, and it's certainly not. It's not panentheism or pantheism. So, if we play a game of philosophical survivor and look at the evidence that we have from biological and cosmological origins, I think we can push a lot of the competing metaphysical hypotheses off the island, and then from that point forward, begin an even more robust inquiry into the nature of the God who has created the universe. Is that the God of Judaism or Islam or Christianity or some non-religious form of theism? And how would we adjudicate between those different systems? I think there you have to evaluate the reliability of special revelation. So I think historical evidence for the reliability of the Bible is crucial as you want to move forward in an investigation of these big questions. But I think there are limits to what we call natural theology. It does give us a moderately thick version of theism using that. It's not a thin version, but it's not a fully robust version as you would derive from Scripture.
Okay, and before we wrap up for today, wanted to ask you about some theists seem to agree in a way that intelligent design is not a science, and I've thought about that, and I've wondered if that's because so take the theological argument, for example. The fine tuning that we observe within the universe is either due to chance, necessity, or design, and it's not due to necessity or chance, therefore it's due to design. And then when we examine your argument and signature of the cell, when you look at DNA, some of the same explanatory hypotheses are there as well. Chance, law, or design. So do you think that resemblance is what makes people think that there's that intelligent design is natural theology, but natural theology is either theology or philosophy, depending on who you ask,
But
and
not science. Yeah.
but not science.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so many theists, they kind of want to put intelligent design there. Oh well, but and then you have to go and say that the argument doesn't give you a robust any it gives you limited qualities or properties about the designer. It doesn't tell you its full nature, whether it's infinite or finite.
Well, I don't think that would be a reason to regard intelligent design as merely theological or philosophical. I think the confusion that people have is that people have learned a stereotyped understanding of the scientific method. And what's typically taught is the hypothetico-deductive method of Karl Popper, and the idea that we need to make predictions that can be repeated under controlled laboratory conditions, and unless we have potentially falsifiable predictions under controlled laboratory conditions, then whatever the idea is, it's not science. The idea in question is not science unless it can make those types of falsifiable predictions. Well, falsification has a limited utility. Falsification of predictive consequences of a hypothesis has a limited applicability in certain branches of science. Turns out that falsification is incredibly hard to achieve on the basis of a single experiment. If an experiment goes wrong, it might be that the theory that generated it was incorrect, or the hypothesis that generated the expectation was incorrect. It might be that the wind was blowing and the sun was in your eyes and there was interference in your laboratory setting, or it might be that your instruments needed to be recalibrated or were broken. There's any number of reasons why a failed prediction might have occurred that have nothing to do with the inadequacy of the theory. And so even in sciences that are involved in making predictions under controlled laboratory conditions, there are all kinds of allowances for making ad hoc hypotheses as to why the prediction did not come out as one expected, that have nothing to do with the problem of the theory. And so many theories will generate failed predictions and will not be falsified because the scientists
theories.
think that there may be some other factors that were
Mm.
responsible. And there's great examples of this in Newton's own work about universal gravitation. He made predictions about planetary orbits that didn't come true, but then posited an ad hoc or auxiliary hypothesis about the existence of another planet that was pulling a known planet off course. Turned out that was actually correct. So, but if you applied Popperian demarcation criteria to analyzing Newtonian physics, you would have had to say it's not scientific. It must be metaphysical or philosophical or something. These demarcation arguments simply don't work. And yet lots of even theistic philosophers have some sort of implicit demarcation. When you say intelligent design isn't science, or when you say anything isn't science, you must have in your mind some implicit definition of science that allows you to make that judgment. But people who make those claims rarely specify what those implicit criteria are. And if they do, I will go to the mat to argue that they cannot justify the application of those criteria in an even-handed way. That if those criteria are used to disqualify intelligent design, they can be equally used to disqualify Darwinism or chemical evolutionary theory or 15 other theories that we have already accepted as being scientific. So I just think this whole enterprise, as we've already been saying, is a little bit benighted. It does not. It's behind the times with developments in philosophy of science. It doesn't work, and we should stop using the term science as a kind of honorific that confers automatic status and authority on an idea, and philosophical as a pejorative or religious as a pejorative, and just simply get back to hypothesis, evidence, observation, that triad, and evaluate the warrant for an idea based on how well the evidence from the world around us matches what we would expect based on our hypothesis, and then call it what you will.
All right. Well, this looks like a great place for me to stop the recording. Dr. Myers, I want to say thank you for coming on and joining us. And to all those who watch, thank you for watching Thought Decoded with Sean Mixon. And today we've decoded the thought of Dr. Steve Myers. And Dr. Myers, this is your invitation to come back. Would love to have you back on.
Next time we'll have to come. We'll have to talk about the evidence. So but this is great, Sean. I really appreciate you driving the conversation in this direction, because I don't think I've talked about this in this depth on any podcast before, and I think you get a couple of philosophers together and look what happens.
So absolutely. Well, thank you all for watching Thought Decoded with Sean Mixon, and always remember to think better.